why is Putin... Is he going to follow through and use any more of these, like he said he would with the hypersonics? I'm still waiting for that one, 2 years and a half. What else can he do from a tactical military standpoint to try to get Ukraine and NATO to back off? We can't.
He certainly is out of bullets in the chamber. You can only threaten nuclear war so much. If America thinks they need $50 billion just to maintain our stockpile of warheads, and Russia spent $66 billion on their entire military, what does that tell you about their state of warheads? Especially when you saw videos of Russian tankers, they open up their reactive armor and there's cardboard in it.
Back up on that. What's that story?
You've never heard of that? So back when the war first started, Russian soldiers were opening up their reactive armor and they're like, what the hell? There's cardboard in here. There weren't any explosives. And so if that's how they treat stuff that's going to be used, how do they treat nuclear weapons that might never be used?
This is The Global Gambit.
All right, guys, we're back in part 2, Ryan. Straight back into it, a bit of a cheeky cliffhanger. But to be fair, your last answer about Iran was quite sort of, they're on the precipice in a certain way of the decisions they have to make. But one of the questions I have for you, this sort of second part, I want to bring in more of the debunking, because I do love that aspect of what you do, is in the pro-Kremlinite side, a lot of their claims I'm seeing at the moment is, where's the footage of the North Koreans? Basically skepticism, but there aren't any North Koreans, let alone 10,000 in Kursk fighting the Ukrainians, fighting with the Russians. What's going on here?
So we really don't know. Well, it certainly seems like Russia has used their North Korean force to backfill in Kursk, but it doesn't seem like they've really been able to utilize these North Koreans effectively as a military force that can actually attack. And I think some of that is there's a language barrier, there's a training barrier, and there is an advantage in having troops backfill in rear areas, right? Like that frees up people to go do other stuff. So it seems like that's kind of the tack that Russia has taken right now. And I don't want to say it seems to be working, but if you squint your eyes really hard, you can believe, right, that this kind of strategy was worth it. I don't know what Russia gave up to North Korea in order to get those troops. It might be oil. It might be missile tech, nuclear tech. But I wouldn't be surprised if Russia is kind of wondering if they got the short end of the stick here.
Well, yeah, because from what I understand, they were gorging themselves on pornography, which is very entertaining, and basically not really achieving much on the battlefield. But the Russians, they get munitions, they get manpower. Well, we think in theory, the North Koreans get access to Russian advanced tech and money, right? This doesn't seem like a very sustainable relationship, at least in this context. Or it doesn't matter. Russia's going to keep it up because it needs it.
I'm not sure. I mean, Russia could certainly look at this and go, you know what, this isn't working. Thanks to the 15,000 troops, we're going to go do something else now. But again, there is an advantage in using troops for rear line details, where they can use their own language to communicate and so on. So that could be an advantage right there. I mean, it's one of those maybes, right? Like, one of the things Russia doesn't want is to be fresh out of friends. That's not a good situation for Russia. If they've run out of friends completely, and now they're like, oh crap, where are we going to get troops now? Because Syria's gone, right? So I could see them continuing the relationship, even if it's fairly lopsided.
But what about because one of the things I remember about the support of Western tech to Ukraine in the earlier phases of the war was, operational ability and just maintenance, and the fact that you needed people on the ground who knew how to take care of the equipment, not just sort of you send in a bunch of tanks and planes and then they take care of the job, right? You've got to maintain them. You've got to make sure that the troops and pilots are able to craft them. Right? So when Russia's trying to get more equipment from other places, isn't there going to be a problem like this from the Kremlin side?
I mean, it's generally going to be a problem to get soldiers at all. One of Russia's biggest issues is that they can't do another round of general conscription again, because then there'll be a revolution, and you'll see Vladimir Putin hanging upside down from a gas station like Mussolini.
Pushed out a
I'm
window.
serious, like that. Look, there for the longest time there has been this deal where the elites of Russia will allow the government to do whatever they want as long as you don't touch our kids, right? So that's why a lot of these soldiers are from areas of the country where there's a lot of poverty. So when you take a look at that, Russia is going back to the well for troops, and it's kind of questionable, like how deep that well goes. Like they could do another general mobilization, but that's going to be a big issue. And I have actually heard one statistic. I don't know how true that is, how true this is, but from what I understand, there's actually more security forces in Russia than there are soldiers on the front. So that means there's going to be more police doing police stuff. And by police stuff, meaning like suppressing the population, suppressing dissent. There's more security services suppressing dissent than there is actually fighting in Ukraine. And that's kind of telling if that statistic is true, because it means Russia is more worried about internal dissent than it is worried about an outside force, like Ukraine pushing back and defeating Russia on the battlefield. So it's always interesting when you see where your priorities are. And it seems like Russia, if this is true, has placed their priorities in making sure that their dissent is crushed within Russia.
It's interesting. Do you have a sense of what security agencies, forces are there? And sort of how that works into the whole apparatus, the architecture?
Oh my God. They have so many security forces. And if I start naming those acronyms off the top of my head, people are going to go, oh, no, technically it was the NRGU, not the, But there's quite a few security forces. In fact, it was the Wall Street Journal that talked about a new security force that doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. And they were the security force, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. This is the problem with doing podcasts, right? Because everybody listening can go look it up and go, my name was wrong. There was this one security force that actually arrested a Wall Street Journal journalist. And nobody had ever heard of these guys before. It's about like 2,000 dudes. And all they do is their specialized job is to run around the country grabbing hostages. So that way Russia has prisoners that they can bargain with Western countries with.
What does this do for Wagner as well? Obviously, they've been largely, I think, incorporated and sort of absorbed by the Russian Defense Ministry and state. But, they've largely just disappeared into the void, right? There isn't much evidence of them.
It certainly seems like it. You don't really hear about Wagner much anymore. I mean, technically, I actually looked this up, did a video about this, about over a year ago, that Prigozhin's, according to Belarusian law, all of Prigozhin's shares go to his wife. So his wife is now essentially the owner of Wagner, right? Theoretically, right? We really don't know what happened. But I mean, that's because I actually wondered about that, and I looked up Belarusian law, and that was the case. So I don't know how well that's actually going for his wife. I can't remember his wife's name.
I didn't even know he had a wife. Wow. Okay, someone could marry. Yeah. That's incredible. Well, okay, but on that side, so we've got the sort of military architecture, but then we've also got the intelligence architecture. And at the time that you and I are chatting, obviously there has been the assassination, the taking out of this very senior general Kirillov, if I'm saying that right. How well does that illustrate Kirillov? People should be like pissed. I'm supposed to be the Russian guy and I can't even say the name. You can't remember your acronyms. I can't remember names. But what's that say about Ukrainian intelligence and the ability for them to get so into Russia's, heartland right? Surely that would
Yeah.
make the Kremlin uncomfortable, but it doesn't seem to do any difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's almost like Ukrainians can walk into Russia and act like Russians, but it seems like it's a lot harder for Russians to walk into Ukraine and act like Ukrainians, and that is that is a very dangerous situation for an adversary, right? When someone can walk into your country, they can pretend to be you, but you can't do the same. So I don't know. I think that it says something that Ukraine is not giving up on asymmetric warfare inside of Russia. This general was a valid target. I think it was like a scooter bomb or something like that. That actually
It was in a scooter. Yeah, he walked out
on a scooter. Was shooting from a scooter? I didn't fully realize.
It was a concealed package, sentry sabotage bomb, and then it was detonated when he came out.
Oh wow,
that's what
that's a lot. That's a lot, and that makes a lot of sense. I don't. So here's the funny thing. Like I wonder if Ukraine is going after the good generals, right? Like let's leave all the bad generals in place, but let's take out the guys who are actually kind of scary. So I could kind of see something like that. Where Ukraine is actually being very selective about who they target because they don't want to target anyone who isn't very good at their job because they keep getting everybody killed, right?
Yeah, well, it reminds me of the explosion with against Alexander Dugin's daughter. What was it? In I think the end of 2022 or around that time.
Yeah, it was a car bomb, I think. Right?
Yeah, it was a car bomb in Moscow. Or St. Petersburg, one of the main city urban centers. It just blew up on the road, and that was the first, I think, earliest illustration of sort of Ukraine beginning to really invest or sort of focus into its intelligence and sort of covert operations side. Do you think, not playing too much of a forecaster, but like going into 25, based on what you've seen over 24, the trajectory of Ukraine developing its own ballistic missile, leveraging its, advantages with its, growing relationships with other European nations, what do you look at and where do you think you could see the biggest gains for the Ukrainians?
Boy, that's a good question. Ballistic missiles, that's a tough one. I don't know how much ballistic missiles could help with the fight because ballistic missiles are very expensive. Ukraine is a big country, but you still have to test that missile. And the second you test it, Russia's getting telemetry on that missile and what this thing can do. So that's kind of an issue. But when you're looking at like capabilities, it actually Ukraine's drone capabilities are only getting better, and they're only becoming better and better at actually implementing those capabilities. And it's almost like a bigger bang for your buck might be going toward drones that are using AI to navigate and detect targets, because something like a cruise missile might be, Russia can shoot down ballistic missiles. Ballistic missiles still have a place. If you have a very time-sensitive target, all right, this Russian general is at this location. We have 15 minutes to strike this guy. Let's fire a ballistic missile. Something like that is very useful for a ballistic missile. But you're not getting to Moscow with the ballistic missile. It will get shot down. You might be able to get to Moscow with a small drone, maybe not that small, with some sort of a homegrown cruise missile that has drone features. Yeah, you might be able to do that. But if you can set a bunch of robotic computerized killers loose on the battlefield, well, now you've just replaced your most precious resource, which is men. And it's almost like it would be easier for Ukraine to kind of focus on their core competencies, drones, AI, and integrate those two things together than it would be to just create another missile that might just get shot down.
Could you apply the same to the Russians? Because earlier on in the month or whatever crossover of the month, we had that Oreshnik missile that was obviously used. I mean, whether or not you believe, I had one guest on called Dmitry Alperovich, and he said these are not new missiles. It's one that was first, shall we say, released or sort of showcased at the beginning of 2011, 2010 or something.
Yeah, it was the R. It was really a version of the Oreshnik. Was really the R-26.
Yeah,
and the reason they used didn't even use warheads in that thing. They used inert warheads, and that was because in order to let me back up even more. The Oreshnik is really an intermediate range ballistic missile, which technically was part of the intermediate range ban treaty, but I think Russia pulled out of that treaty, and I believe the U.S. also pulled out of that treaty. I think. I mean, people are going to be yelling at me.
2018, Trump pulled out of it in 2018, and then the Russians followed.
So, with the intermediate ban treaty, this missile, it's kind of interesting to even have this thing. It kind of makes sense because I guess it could strike Europe. But in order to hit something, in order to cause an explosion with something going that fast, going Mach 10, you have to start that explosion fairly high up. So it's not like this missile is going, or the warhead is going so fast that even chemical explosions take time. All right. So the distance those chemicals might actually be traveling as the warhead is exploding, that might have to start like a kilometer above the actual target. Like, let's start the process of detonating. So in order to do that, you have to have very accurate fuses. And I'm not sure that Russia has the capability right now to develop, like, push money into such a, I don't want to say esoteric, but such a niche weapon, right? Like, this is something where we might only use once. Let's just try to scare people that there might be a nuclear war, and we'll go with that. So that might have been the reason why they used these inert warheads. They just literally didn't have anything that could actually explode because it would have required a complete redesign of the weapon.
But isn't it completely ridiculous? I mean, but I'm not really going to. We can joke about that, or joke. We can humor the whole nuclear war, World War III thing, and the use of a tactical warhead or something. But it doesn't benefit the Kremlin at all, right? So why is Putin? Is he going to follow through and use any more of these, like he said he would with the hypersonics? I'm still waiting for that one, 2 years and a half. What else can he do from a tactical military standpoint to try to get Ukraine and NATO to back off? We can't.
He certainly is out of bullets in the chamber. You can only threaten nuclear war so much before people go like, all right, what else you got? And I've gotten into the whole question of, like, is this even real, right? Like, do Russia's weapons even work? Because when you look at things like plutonium reprocessing, I mean, plutonium has a half-life of like 24,000 years, but you'll get these helium bubbles. Plutonium decays naturally. You'll get these little helium bubbles inside plutonium. You need to reprocess the plutonium every once in a while. Tritium is a half-life of, God, I'm going to get yelled at. I think it was like 12.5 years. People are going to yell at me. But like so that means, like, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we've been through 2.5 tritium cycles. So there's, they have to replace this stuff. And if you're not replacing this stuff, then your weapons aren't going to work all that well. And, the U.S., I think back in 2021, so the last year we had data, the U.S. spent about $50 billion on their military. Russia spent about $66 billion. I'm sorry. The U.S. spent about $50 billion on their nuclear program. So just maintaining our arsenal of nuclear weapons, the U.S. spent $50 billion. Russia spent $66 billion on their entire military. So the U.S. and Russia have about between 1,500 and 1,700 warheads, depending on the source, right? It's both roughly equal. And there's more warheads in storage, but like ready warheads, about 1,700-ish. right? 16, 1700. So if America thinks they need $50 billion just to maintain our stockpile of warheads, and Russia spent $66 billion on their entire military, what does that tell you about their state of warheads, right? If they have roughly the same amount of warheads, but they didn't spend as much as us, what does that tell you about their state of warheads? Especially when you saw videos of if Russian tankers, they open up their reactive armor and there's cardboard in it. Oh, okay. Well, if that's how they treat equipment.
Back up on that. What's that? The story?
You've never heard of that. So back when the war first started, wow, surprised you haven't heard of that. So back when the war first started, there was this issue of Russian tanks. Like some guys, there's pictures of it. You can Google this. Some Russian tanks, guys noticed that the reactive armor on their tanks, and reactive armor is an explosive that you put on the outside of a tank so that when a shell hits you, the armor explodes outward and it kind of prevents the jet of molten copper from like a high explosive anti-tank round from penetrating your armor. It dissipates that jet of molten metal. And the reactive armor can only be used once. Like once it's hit, it's gone. That area of the tank is exposed. But Russian soldiers were opening up their reactive armor, and they're like, "What the hell? There's cardboard in here. There weren't any explosives." And so that kind of, I know, right? And someone lied. Someone took the money that was supposed to go for reactive armor and they pocketed it and they put cardboard in there instead. So if that's how they treat stuff that's going to be used, how do they treat nuclear weapons that might never be used? Like that's kind of a question right there.
It's actually a really interesting angle that I've never considered properly. The extent to which they just don't have the financial capacity to sustain, the basics. But that's quite interesting because also, how much do we take what they say in public availability of data, right? What they release as at face value. The Chinese, right? I was reading one analysis piece from CSIS, I think, and it was talking about the fact that I think the Chinese military expenditure is about 170, 180 billion. But by estimations, because the Chinese are very cagey about certain information, they've reduced also the amount of public data they produce after their economy has gone down and the population and youth unemployment. So I wouldn't be a stretch that they do this with their military. And so these some projections said that they might actually be spending more about 450 billion. Do you think that these states, I'm not trying to classify them all together, each country has its own approaches and stuff, but like certain assumptions, could we think that they are just underreporting the actual size of their military budgets?
It's possible, but you could also do what covert cabal does and start counting things. I'm serious. Like, all right, how often do they leave their barracks? How often do they perform exercises? How many contracts were issued for people to supply boots? Because if the military put out a contract for 200,000 pairs of boots, and you know that 100,000 soldiers are joining the military that year, all right, every soldier gets 2 pairs of boots. All right, yeah, that sounds like it's in line. So that is one way to do it, right? That's open source intelligence in a nutshell, right? Like using open sources, saying like, okay, what is available openly to try to figure out the actual size of the Chinese. So I don't know what the answer might be for that. I don't know. That's a very good question as to whether they're overstating the size of their military, but we can figure it out easily enough.
Well, there was an interesting study done by a paper in Chicago University a couple of years ago, and they're saying that sort of, by all accounts, the Chinese economy is actually only 60% of what they claim it to be. Because if you look at the infrastructure, like literally the lights available, if you look at a map of South Korea or a satellite imagery of South Korea versus North Korea, right, you can see the infrastructure versus on one side versus the other. And so they looked at sort of the size of China and Western provinces like Zhejiang and I mispronounced that, guys. Sorry. Both of us are having mispronunciations today. But it's, so I don't know. I feel like it's not too much of a stretch. I certainly think the Chinese So when you see, I'll put it this way. When you see the Chinese and the Russians engaging in their exercises, that amounts for nothing. It just shows that they're operationally sound, but they don't actually have the equipment built in a way that might be able to withstand us to your, they've got cardboard instead of actual armor in there.
Yeah, that could be a case. I don't think that's the case in China.
Right.
But that was certainly the case in Russia when the war started. Not all tanks had their reactive armor plugged with cardboard, but enough did that it became a thing. And it became a thing to look out for. And interesting.
All of this has underlying themes of cloak and dagger, disinformation, sleight of hand, misdirection. So one of the things I just had to get into with you briefly was this whole situation with drones, right? So you mentioned the role of the media and the New York Times leading to X, Y, and Z in part one. But now we've got the situation where sort of all this drone stuff is happening over New Jersey, right? Are they looking for nuclear weapons? I don't think so. But when you find these sorts of things, why do people even humor? It goes back to what we first had in our a conversation at the beginning of the year, Ryan, which is why do people like to believe idiotic ideas? Right? Why do people believe that there's some, Project Blue Book is happening in Northeast America on the 24th of, why?
So some of it is political. And, I work for a conservative news channel. I work for Newsmax. In fact, I'm going on Sebastian Gorka in 30 minutes. And, one of the things that I think that some people are suffering from is they're the dog that caught the car and they don't know what to do with it. So we have some members who supported President Trump who, yes, we got this guy elected. Awesome. And yet they still hate the Democrats and they still hate President Biden so much that everything is Biden's fault, including, Biden wants a war with Russia. This one guy who said he knew what was going on with the New Jersey drones. He was, we all know Biden wants a war with Russia, right? And he lied. Right? America does not want a war with Russia. That is not what we want right now. In fact, that's not what Russia should want either, because I think I calculated we could probably be in Moscow in 62 days.
Based on what?
So, based on a 6-week air campaign, and then I think it was like a 16-day ground campaign.
2 weeks.
Wow, 16-day. I mean, look, you have the air campaign first, because the air campaign attrits Russia's air defense capabilities. You start with taking out their surface-to-air missile launchers. Once you do that, you take out their air force. Once you do that, you start hitting their logistics convoys. Then people on the front are hungry, and hungry soldiers don't fight all that well. And you should be able to blow through their lines without too much trouble when you have hungry soldiers. Also, look, hungry soldiers, if they have a rifle and they're near a civilian area, they're going to take that rifle and they're going to get food, right? That means they're not on the front lines anymore. It means they're looking for food. So, yeah, I think I'd figured it would take...
But is that unilateral by the United States, or that's a NATO line?
No, we would have to do it as a NATO thing, because you would have to travel through these countries. But yeah, that would be the optimistic thing. Look, Iraq fell in 21 days. Afghanistan fell in about 6 weeks. America is really good at invading people. We're like Pablo Picasso of invading people. Not so good at sustaining. Not so good at that. We could use some help on the after the war. I was going to
talk about it's all about after war, but do you know how to end it? So
yeah, we had no idea how to end it. We're great at starting them, though.
Well, on that rather precarious.
I think that that this the conspiracy theory thing, a lot of it goes back to the fact that when COVID happened in the U.S., the government lied. The government said, "Don't wear a mask," and they said that because they didn't want people to buy all the surgical masks. And they said, okay, wear a mask. And we're like, well, you told us don't wear a mask. It doesn't help. And now we have to wear masks. And I think when that happened, it really changed something in America's psyche. And I'm not a COVID denier or anything like that, but I'm stating what America suddenly turned into when the government lied to people, hoping that they wouldn't buy up surgical masks and reduce the supply for hospitals. I think that really changed things. And now America is kind of like that spouse who's always hiding her phone when you're in the room, right? Like, we don't trust her anymore. We don't trust the government anymore. And maybe we shouldn't until the government can prove to us that it can tell the truth. And right now, there's a lot of people who don't feel like the government is telling the truth about these drones that were over New Jersey. And in an environment like that, that's where conspiracy theories fill the void.
But is Trump going to help with that? Is he going to save the American psyche?
I think for some people, maybe, but I think it might flip to the other side. You know, when this whole thing first happened, and when I quit my job to do YouTube full time, there was a part of me that thought, you know, like if this war in Ukraine ends, I might be in a lot of trouble financially, right? But I can always go back to writing software or something like that, right? I want the war to end. And then the war in Gaza started. And I thought, oh, there's another topic that I can cover. And then the misinformation grew and grew and grew, and I started doing the misinformation thing. And now, wow, I'm always going to have a job. Because if the Democrats are in charge, you're going to have Republicans spread misinformation. If the Republicans are in charge, you're going to have Democrats spread misinformation. That was the case with, there was a document about this paper by the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025. And this infographic was full of lies. I think it was only 17% truth in this infographic. And I don't care what political party you're from, I'm a centrist. If you spread misinformation, I will nail you to the freaking wall.
Well, there's an answer to that, Ryan, which is just to get Jill Stein in.
Okay. Yeah, all right. She can invite Putin to the inauguration.
It's been a pleasure, everyone. Part 2 with Ryan Macbeth. It's always a pleasure, Ryan. I look forward to doing this with you many more times, hopefully, next year. Maybe with some slightly more positive vibes. But as always, everyone, as we say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be playing. Take care, everyone.